"Let me see you," the Mountain Cowboy said, and the wind seemed to stop halfway across the ridge as if even it was waiting for what came next. She stood no more than 20 feet away, boots half buried in fresh snow, one hand pressed tight against her shoulder where dark fabric clung heavy and damp, her breathing shallow but steady, the kind of steady that comes from refusing to fall rather than having strength left to stand, and her eyes, sharp, unblinking, locked onto him like he was just another danger wearing a different shape. Ethan Cole didn't move closer, didn't reach for the rifle resting against the cabin wall behind him, didn't even shift his weight. The only thing he did was lower his gaze for half a second, just enough to let her see he wasn't measuring distance for a fight, then lifted again, calm as winter stone. "That wound's deeper than you're pretending," he said, voice low, carried thin by the cold air, not a command, not quite a question either. She didn't answer. Her fingers tightened instead, pressing harder into her shoulder like she could hold whatever was leaking out from ever reaching the ground. And for a moment the only sound between them was the faint creak of pine trees and the slow, soft drop of melted snow sliding from the cabin roof. Ethan noticed everything the way men who lived alone learned to notice. How her stance favored one side. How her boots were worn down at the heel from miles that didn't offer rest. How the knife in her other hand wasn't raised, but wasn't lowered either, caught somewhere between trust and survival. "If I meant harm," he added after a beat, "you'd already know it." That got a flicker, just a small one, a shift in her eyes that passed as quickly as it came, but it was there. He saw it. He always saw the small things. Somewhere far down the slope, beyond the line of frozen trees, a faint echo of hooves carried through the valley, distant but steady, the kind of sound that didn't belong to wanderers or lost travelers. Her head turned just slightly at that, not enough to break focus on him, just enough to listen, and in that single movement Ethan understood more than she had said out loud. Someone was coming. Not for him. For her. He exhaled slowly, the breath turning to fog in front of his face, then stepped back instead of forward, one single step that opened space between them rather than closing it. "Cabin's warm," he said, nodding once toward the door behind him, its wood worn smooth by years of wind and silence. "Fire's still alive." She didn't move, didn't lower the knife, didn't accept, but she didn't leave either. And sometimes, out here, that was the first kind of answer that mattered. Ethan turned slightly, just enough to reach down and set his rifle flat on the snow, the metal catching a dull gray light, far enough from his hands that even a frightened stranger could see the choice he was making without needing it explained. When he straightened again, he met her eyes the same way he had before, steady, unarmed in every way that counted. "Let me see you," he repeated, quieter this time, not as a demand, but as something closer to an offer. And for a long second that stretched like a mile of open land, nothing changed, until finally, just barely, her grip loosened, not enough to trust him, but enough to consider that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the danger she had been running from. She did not step forward right away, and Ethan did not expect her to, because trust out here did not come in strides. It came in inches, earned slow and often paid for twice. And he could see the calculation behind her eyes as clearly as he could see the frost forming along the edge of her sleeve, the way she measured the door behind him, the rifle in the snow, the distance to the tree line, the sound of those distant riders growing just a little louder with each passing second. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of leather and smoke from inside the cabin, and something in that warmth seemed to reach her before his words ever could, because her shoulders lowered by the smallest degree, not surrender, not even acceptance, just the kind of quiet adjustment a person makes when the cold starts losing its grip. Ethan turned his head slightly, listening now, the rhythm of hooves clearer than before, not rushing but steady, purposeful, the kind of riders who already knew where they were going, and he knew that if she heard it the way he did, then she understood just as well as he did that standing out here in the open was not a choice that would hold much longer. "They are not far," he said, not looking back at her when he spoke, giving her the dignity of deciding without pressure, the same way his mother once told him people deserved when fear was the only thing keeping them upright. For a moment, nothing happened. Then her hand moved, slow, deliberate, the knife lowering just an inch, not dropped, not forgotten, but no longer pointed at his chest like it had been moments before, and that single inch felt heavier than any weapon either of them could have drawn. She took one step. It was uneven, her weight shifting wrong, the kind of step that told a story of miles walked without rest, and Ethan did not move to help, even though every instinct in him said to close the distance. Because he understood something most men out here never learned, that helping too soon could feel the same as taking control. She took another step, closer now, the snow crunching under her boots, her breath catching just slightly as the pain she refused to show finally demanded its share. And when she reached the edge of the porch, she paused again, eyes flicking once more toward the valley behind her, where the riders had become more than just sound, where shadows now moved between the trees. Ethan stepped aside then, not dramatic, not hurried, just enough to clear the doorway, his hand brushing the wood as he pushed it open wider, letting the firelight spill out into the cold like a quiet promise. "No one will touch you in there," he said, voice even, not strong, not soft, just certain in a way that did not need to be proven. She looked at him one more time, long enough that he could see the question she did not ask, the kind that had no easy answer. And then she crossed the threshold, not because she trusted him, but because whatever was coming behind her left her with fewer reasons to stay outside. Ethan followed only after she was inside, closing the door against the wind, against the sound of hooves that now echoed clearer through the valley. And for a brief moment, as the latch settled into place and the fire crackled low and steady, the world outside seemed to pause, like it was waiting to see what kind of man he would choose to be next. The warmth inside the cabin did not welcome her the way it would have welcomed most people. It pressed in close instead, heavy with the scent of burning pine and old leather, the kind of warmth that asked for trust she was not ready to give. And she stopped just 3 steps past the door, her eyes moving quickly, measuring the space the same way she had measured him outside, counting exits, shadows, anything that might turn against her if she let her guard slip even for a second. Ethan did not move toward her. He crossed to the hearth instead, slow and deliberate, crouching just enough to adjust a piece of wood in the fire, the flames answering with a low crackle that filled the silence without breaking it, giving her something to hear other than her own breathing. "You can stand there all night," he said after a moment, not turning around. But the cold already took more than it should have. She said nothing, but he heard the faint shift of her weight, the subtle drag of her boot against the floorboards, and when he stood again, he kept his hands visible, resting loosely at his sides, never reaching, never assuming. The knife was still in her hand. It had not lowered any further. He respected that. Outside, the sound of hooves carried clearer now, closer than before, no longer a distant echo, but something with direction, and Ethan glanced once toward the window, the glass faintly clouded from the heat inside meeting the cold without, then back to her. "They will be here before long," he said quietly, and this time she answered, her voice low, edged with something worn but unbroken. "Then you should let me leave." Ethan shook his head once, small, certain. "If you walk out that door now, they will see you before you clear the ridge." She held his gaze, searching for something behind his words, something selfish, something that would explain why he was doing this. But whatever she expected to find was not there, and that seemed to unsettle her more than if it had been. A flicker of pain crossed her face then, quick and sharp, and her hand tightened again at her shoulder, her breath catching just enough to betray what she had been holding back since the snow. Ethan noticed. He always noticed. He took a step toward the table, not toward her, reaching instead for a small tin and a folded strip of clean cloth, the movements practiced, quiet, the kind that came from years of tending to himself when no one else was there to do it for him. "Sit," he said, nodding toward a chair near the fire, the words simple, without force. She did not move. The knife lifted a fraction again, not in threat, but in reminder. He stopped where he was, placing the cloth and tin down on the table between them, then stepping back, creating space again, the same careful distance he had kept outside. "You do it," he added, meeting her eyes. "I will not touch you." That landed. Not like a blow, not like a command, but like something unexpected, something that did not fit the story she had been told, and for a long second she did not look away, as if trying to decide whether the man in front of her was real or just another version of the same lie she had learned to survive. The fire shifted, light moving across the walls, across his face, across the space between them, and slowly, carefully, she moved toward the chair, each step measured, the knife still in her hand, until she reached it and lowered herself down with a controlled breath that still could not hide the strain. Her other hand released her shoulder just enough to reveal the tear in the fabric beneath, dark and heavy, and Ethan looked away then, not out of discomfort, but out of respect, giving her the privacy to tend to herself without his eyes turning it into something else. Outside, the hooves grew louder still, now unmistakable, now close enough that the earth itself seemed to carry their rhythm, and inside the cabin, between the firelight and the silence, something fragile and unfamiliar settled into place. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of something that might one day become it. The cloth trembled slightly in her hand, not from hesitation alone, but from the weight of what it meant to sit there in a stranger's cabin while danger rode closer with every passing second, and Ethan could hear it in the way the fabric brushed against itself, soft but uneven, like a rhythm that had not yet found its ground. He stayed where he was, near the far wall, one shoulder resting lightly against the wood, his eyes not fixed on her but aware of her, the way a man watches a storm without staring straight into it, giving it space to pass or break on its own terms. The fire cracked again, louder this time, sending a brief flare of light across the room, and in that flicker he caught a glimpse of something around her neck, a thin cord barely visible beneath the edge of her collar, something small resting against her skin that did not belong to the cold or the road. He did not mention it. Not yet. Outside, the sound of hooves slowed, no longer just approaching but searching, circling the lower edge of the ridge, and the faint jingle of tack carried through the walls like a warning whispered through wood and air. She heard it too. He saw the way her shoulders tightened again, the way her head turned just slightly toward the door without losing track of him, as if she still had not decided which danger stood closer. "They will look for tracks," she said, her voice quieter now, less guarded but no less strong, and it was the first time she had spoken without pushing him away. Ethan nodded once. "Snow covers more than it shows," he replied, his tone steady, as if he had spent years listening to the land speak in ways most men ignored. She pressed the cloth against her shoulder then, slower this time, more careful, and though the pain still showed in the tightening of her jaw, there was less resistance in the movement, less fight against the fact that she needed help, even if she refused to ask for it. The tin sat open beside her, the faint scent of herbs rising into the warm air, something clean, something grounding, and for a moment the cabin felt smaller, quieter, like the world outside had stepped back just far enough to let something else take its place. Ethan shifted then, just a fraction, pushing away from the wall and stepping toward the window, his boots soft against the floor, his hand lifting just enough to clear a small circle in the fogged glass with the back of his knuckles. Through it, he could see movement below, dark shapes against the pale snow, riders moving slow now, deliberate, scanning the slope, and he exhaled once, not in fear, not in doubt, but in recognition of what was coming. He did not reach for the rifle. He did not check the door. Instead, he turned back toward her, his gaze settling not on the knife still resting in her hand, but on the cord at her neck that had slipped just enough into view under the firelight. "That piece you wear," he said quietly, choosing his words with care. "Where did you get it?" She stilled at that, the cloth pausing mid-motion, her eyes lifting to meet his again, sharper now, more guarded, as if the question had crossed a line nothing else had. For a moment, it seemed she would not answer at all. Then, slowly, her hand moved, not to hide it, but to rest against it, fingers curling lightly around the small object beneath the cord. "It was not given," she said, her voice carrying something deeper than before, something tied to memory rather than survival. "It was found." Ethan's gaze did not waver, but something behind it shifted, subtle, like a door inside him opening just enough to let an old thought breathe again. The firelight caught the edge of the cord once more, revealing a faint glint of silver, worn but familiar in a way that made his chest tighten without warning. Outside, a horse snorted, closer now, followed by the soft crunch of hooves stopping somewhere just beyond the trees, and inside the cabin, between the question he had asked and the answer she had given, something unseen began to take shape, not yet understood, but already impossible to ignore. Her fingers remained curled around the small silver piece at her neck, as if the question had reached deeper than the cold or the pain ever could, and for a moment she did not seem like someone hiding from riders or fighting to stay on her feet, but someone holding on to something older than both of them, something that did not belong to this cabin or this night. Ethan did not press her again. He had learned long ago that truth, like trust, came when it chose to, not when it was pulled. Outside, the sound of movement shifted, no longer circling but settling. The low murmur of voices barely carried through the walls, too distant to understand but close enough to feel, like a storm waiting just beyond the ridge line. He turned his attention back to the window for a brief second, enough to confirm what he already knew, then let the frost settle again over the glass as his hand dropped away. "They will not rush," he said quietly, more to the room than to her, but she heard it all the same. "Men who are certain do not hurry." She watched him as he spoke, her expression tightening slightly, not in fear but in recognition, as if she understood that kind of patience, that kind of danger, in ways most people never would. The cloth in her hand pressed more firmly now, steadier, the trembling less noticeable, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something different, not softer, but less guarded by instinct alone. "They believe I carry something that belongs to them." Ethan's gaze shifted back to her, not sharp, not questioning, just attentive, the way a man listens when he knows the words matter more than the answer. "Do you?" he asked. She held his eyes for a long second, then shook her head once, slow and certain. "No," she said. "What I carry was never theirs." The fire snapped again, sending a brief shower of sparks up the chimney, and in that sound something inside the room seemed to settle into place, as if a line had been drawn without either of them naming it. Ethan took a step then, not toward her, but toward the table, reaching for the tin she had opened, closing it carefully before setting it back down, his movements quiet, deliberate, grounding the space between them. "Then they are not here for what you have," he said. "They are here for what they think you are." She did not answer that right away, but her hand slowly released the cord at her neck, letting the small silver piece rest once more against her skin, visible now in the firelight, worn smooth at the edges, shaped by years rather than design, and Ethan's eyes caught it fully for the first time. Recognition did not come like a flash. It came like weight. Slow. Certain. The kind that settles in the chest before the mind can name it. He had seen something like it. Before. Not once. Not clearly. But enough to know it did not belong to chance. "I knew someone who carried one like that," he said after a moment, his voice lower now, touched by something that had not been there before. She looked up at him again, sharper this time, not defensive, but alert, as if the distance between them had shifted in a way neither of them had expected. "You are mistaken," she said, but there was hesitation there, small, almost hidden, the kind that does not lie well under steady eyes. Ethan shook his head slightly. "I do not mistake things like that," he replied, not with pride, not with insistence, just with the quiet certainty of a man who had spent years remembering the few things that mattered. Outside, a horse shifted closer, the sound of leather tightening, followed by a voice calling out, low and distant, but unmistakably directed toward the cabin, and the moment between them tightened again, pulled back into the present like a rope drawn taut. Ethan did not look toward the door this time. He kept his eyes on her, on the silver piece, on the space between what had been said and what had not. "Whatever that is," he added, just above a whisper, "it brought you here." And though the riders waited outside, though the night held its breath around the cabin, the truth of that statement lingered heavier than anything beyond the walls. The voice outside came again, closer now, clearer, not raised, not urgent, just certain in the way men speak when they believe the answer is already waiting behind a door, and the sound of it settled into the cabin like a weight that did not belong to either of them. She did not look toward the door this time. Her eyes stayed on Ethan, searching him in a way that was no longer about measuring threat, but about understanding something she had not expected to find, and her hand moved once more to the silver piece at her neck, holding it not out of fear now, but as if it grounded her to something older than the moment pressing in around them. "You said you knew someone," she said, her voice steady despite the quiet tightening of the world outside. Ethan did not answer right away. He took a slow breath, the kind a man takes when the past steps forward without asking permission, and his gaze drifted, not away from her, but through her, as if he was seeing something layered over the present, something that had never quite left him. Years ago, he said finally, his tone softer, not weaker, just deeper. There was a woman who came through these mountains. Not lost, not afraid, just passing through like the land belonged to her more than anyone else. The firelight shifted as he spoke, catching in his eyes, reflecting something that had nothing to do with the flames themselves. She wore a piece like that, he continued, nodding slightly toward the silver resting against her collarbone. Said it was made by her mother. Said it was given to someone who saved her life. The room grew quieter with those words, as if even the fire chose to listen instead of speak, and she felt it, the connection forming not as a bridge, but as a question that neither of them had expected to ask. That woman, she said slowly, her voice carrying something fragile beneath its strength, she is gone. Ethan nodded once. I know, he replied, and there was no surprise in it, no denial, only acceptance shaped by time. She did not come back. Outside, the faint sound of boots on snow reached the porch, measured, deliberate, followed by a pause that stretched long enough to be felt in the chest, and then a hand brushed lightly against the door, not knocking, not forcing, just reminding whoever was inside that the world had arrived and would not be ignored forever. Ethan turned then, not quickly, not sharply, just enough to face the door, his posture straightening, his presence settling into something solid and unmoving, like the mountains beyond the walls. He did not reach for the rifle. He did not step away. He simply stood. Behind him, she rose from the chair, slower now, the pain still there but no longer defining her movement. And for the first time since she had entered the cabin, the knife in her hand lowered completely, not dropped, not forgotten, but no longer needed in the same way it had been before. If they take me, she said quietly, the words almost lost in the space between them. This ends here. Ethan did not turn back. His gaze remained fixed on the door, on the shadow that shifted faintly beneath it, on the presence waiting just outside. It does not end like that, he said, his voice calm, steady, carrying a weight that did not ask for belief but made room for it anyway. The hand outside rested against the wood once more, and then a voice followed, closer now, clearer, shaped by confidence rather than threat. We know you are in there, it called, not loud, not harsh, just certain. Ethan took one step forward, placing himself between the door and everything behind him, and in that single movement, something changed, not in the room, not in the night, but in the space between what was expected and what would happen next. He did not answer the voice right away. He let the silence hold for a breath longer than comfort allowed, then another, until even the men outside seemed to wait for him, and only then did he speak, his words simple, measured, carrying no anger, no fear, only truth. You should turn around, he said, not raising his voice, not stepping back, because what you are looking for is not yours to take. And in the quiet that followed, deeper than before, heavier than before, the choice he had made settled into place like something that had been waiting for this moment all along. The silence after his words did not break right away. It stretched instead, thin and tense, like ice holding weight it was not meant to carry, and outside the cabin the men did not answer at first, as if they were measuring him the same way she had, weighing his voice against what they expected to find behind that door. Then a soft chuckle came through the wood, low and controlled, the kind that carried no humor, only certainty. That is a fine thought, the voice replied, closer now, just beyond the doorframe. But thoughts do not change what belongs to us. Ethan did not move, not a shift of his shoulders, not a turn of his head. He stood there with the same stillness he had held since the moment she stepped inside, the kind of stillness that did not come from stubbornness, but from knowing exactly where a man chose to stand. Behind him, she watched, her breath quieter now, more measured, the knife still in her hand but resting low, forgotten in a way she had not allowed herself before, because something about the way he spoke, the way he did not reach for anything but his own voice, had changed the shape of the moment without forcing it. You came a long way up this ridge, Ethan said after a beat, his tone even, almost conversational, as if he were speaking to a neighbor rather than men who had followed tracks through miles of snow. You can go the same way back. There was a pause outside, longer this time, followed by the faint sound of boots shifting against the porch, wood creaking under weight, and when the voice came again, it carried less patience than before, though it never rose. "We are not here for you," it said. "We are here for what is inside." Ethan's eyes flicked once, just once, toward the silver at her neck, then returned to the door. "You are mistaken," he answered, simple, steady, leaving no room for argument in the space he allowed the words to occupy. The wind pressed softly against the walls, carrying a fine dust of snow that brushed against the cabin like fingers testing its edges, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow to that door, that voice, that line drawn between them. Behind him, she took a step forward, not all the way, not close enough to stand beside him, but closer than she had been before, and the sound of it, soft against the floorboards, did not go unnoticed. Ethan did not turn. He did not acknowledge it. But something in his stance settled deeper, as if that single step had anchored him more firmly than anything else could have. "You do not understand," the voice outside said, quieter now, more deliberate, each word placed carefully. "The thing she carries has value. More than you know. More than she knows." Ethan let a small breath leave him, not in frustration, not in doubt, just in recognition of how often men used the word value when they meant control. "Then you should have left it where it was found," he replied, and there was something different in his tone now, something that carried not just calm, but memory, something shaped by a past that had already decided what kind of man he would be when this moment came. Another pause followed, heavier this time, and then the faint sound of a hand brushing against the door again, slower now, almost thoughtful. "You are choosing a hard road," the voice said. Ethan's answer came without hesitation. It was chosen long before tonight. Behind him, she felt those words settle in a place she had kept guarded for years, not because she believed them yet, but because she understood them, and understanding, out here, was the first step towards something stronger than fear. Outside, the boots shifted again, then stilled, and the voice did not come back right away, as if even the men beyond the door needed a moment to consider the shape of what stood between them and what they wanted. Inside, the fire burned low and steady, casting long shadows that stretched across the walls and over the space between two people who had met as strangers and now stood on the same side of something neither of them had planned. And in that quiet, held between breath and decision, the night waited to see who would step back first. The quiet did not last forever, but it held long enough to change something in the air, long enough for the certainty outside to lose a fraction of its edge. And when the voice came again, it carried a different weight, not weaker, but more careful, as if the man speaking had begun to understand that whatever stood inside that cabin was not going to move the way he expected. "You are protecting something you do not understand," he said, slower now, each word placed like a step on uncertain ground. Ethan's eyes did not leave the door. "That is not new," he replied, his voice calm, almost quiet enough to be mistaken for indifference. But there was something beneath it that held firm, something that did not bend with pressure or reason. Behind him, she felt that steadiness settle into her bones in a way she had not known she needed, not as safety, but as something close to it, something that made the room feel less like a place she had taken shelter in and more like a place that had chosen to stand with her. Her fingers brushed the silver at her neck again, not out of fear now, but out of memory, and for the first time since the night had begun, her shoulders lowered just enough to show the difference between surviving and breathing. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a faint swirl of snow across the porch, and the men moved with it, their presence no longer pressing forward, but adjusting, as if the ground beneath them had changed in a way they could not quite explain. "We can wait," the voice said after a moment, quieter now, less certain, though it tried to hide it. "Morning always changes things." Ethan let a small pause sit between them before answering, not rushing, not filling the space too quickly, giving the words time to matter. "Morning shows things as they are," he said. "It does not change them." That answer lingered, and for a second there was no reply, only the sound of a horse shifting its weight, the faint jingle of metal against leather, and then something else, something softer, like a decision being made without needing to be spoken. Behind Ethan, she took another step forward, closer now, not beside him, but near enough that the distance between them no longer felt like a divide, and when she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the cabin, steady, unhidden. "You are looking in the wrong place," she said, her words directed not at Ethan, but at the men beyond the door, and there was no fear in them now, only truth shaped by something deeper than the night around them. Ethan did not turn, but he heard it, the shift in her voice, the absence of hesitation, and something in his chest eased without him naming it. Outside, the voice answered after a longer pause than before. "Then where should we be looking?" it asked, and this time the question did not carry command, only the edge of curiosity wrapped in caution. She held her ground, her hand no longer gripping the knife, her posture no longer guarded by instinct alone. "At yourselves," she said, and the words landed in the quiet like something heavier than accusation, something that did not need force to be felt. The wind moved again, softer now, brushing past the cabin like a breath released after being held too long, and for a moment nothing followed, no reply, no step, no demand, only the weight of what had been said settling into the space between inside and out. Ethan remained where he was, unmoving, his presence still, his choice unchanged, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tension that had filled the night began to loosen, not gone, not resolved, but shifted, like a storm that had chosen not to break after all. Outside, a boot scraped lightly against the wood, then another, and the sound of movement began again, not forward, not toward the door, but away from it, one step at a time, until the porch creaked empty and the night, for the first time since she had reached the cabin, felt wide again. The sound of hooves did not vanish all at once, it faded slowly, like something unwilling to admit it had been turned away, each step carrying less certainty than the last, until even the echo of it seemed to dissolve into the open stretch of the valley, leaving behind a silence that felt wider than before, deeper, as if the land itself had exhaled. Ethan did not move from the door right away. He stood there, listening past what was no longer there, the way men who live alone learn to listen for what might return, his posture unchanged, his presence still anchored in the choice he had made. Behind him, she remained where she was, close enough now that the distance between them no longer felt like a boundary, but not yet something that could be called ease, her breathing steady, her hand no longer resting on the knife, which hung loosely at her side, as if it had lost its purpose for the first time since she had stepped into his world. The fire burned low, the wood settling into quiet embers that cast a softer light across the room, and in that glow, the edges of things seemed less sharp, less defined by tension and more by presence. Ethan finally shifted, just enough to turn his head slightly, not fully facing her, but no longer standing with his back to her either, his voice breaking the silence in a tone that carried no urgency, no command, only a simple acknowledgement. "They are gone." She did not answer immediately. Her eyes moved toward the door, as if confirming it for herself, as if trust required more than words, and then slowly, her shoulders lowered another inch, the kind of movement that did not announce itself but changed everything around it. "For now," she said quietly, and there was no fear in it, only truth shaped by experience. Ethan nodded once, accepting that without argument, because he understood that some things did not need to be softened to be endured. He stepped away from the door then, crossing the room at an unhurried pace, stopping near the table where the tin and cloth still rested, his hand brushing the edge of it, as if grounding himself back into the space that was his before this night began. "You can rest," he said, not looking directly at her, giving her the same choice he had given her before, without pressure, without expectation. "No one will come back before morning." She watched him as he spoke, her gaze no longer searching for weakness or deception, but something else now, something quieter, something that had begun to take shape the moment he placed himself between her and the door. "You speak as if you know them," she said. Ethan paused for a moment, his hand still resting lightly on the table, and when he answered, his voice carried a weight that did not come from the night outside, but from something that had lived in him long before it. "I know men like that," he said. "They follow what they think is theirs until they are shown it is not." The fire shifted again, a soft collapse of wood into ember, and the sound filled the space between them like a punctuation neither of them needed to name. She took a slow breath then, deeper than before, and her hand lifted once more to the silver at her neck, not gripping it this time, just touching it, as if confirming that it was still there, that it had brought her this far and had not yet finished what it came to do. "You said someone wore one like this," she said, her voice lower now, not guarded, but careful in a different way. Ethan's eyes lifted slightly, meeting hers fully for the first time since the men had left, and in that look there was no distance left to hide behind. "She did," he replied, "and she told me something once I did not understand until now." She held his gaze, waiting, not with impatience, but with a quiet readiness that had replaced the tension she carried when she first stepped through his door. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath steady, the words coming without hesitation, as if they had been waiting for this exact moment to be spoken. "She said some things are not meant to be kept," he said. "They are meant to find where they belong." The cabin fell silent again after that, not heavy, not strained, but full in a way that did not need to be filled. And as the fire burned low and the night stretched wide beyond the walls, something unspoken passed between them, not a promise, not yet, but something close enough to be felt all the same. The words lingered in the air long after he spoke them, not loud, not heavy, but settled in a way that made the room feel different, as if something unseen had shifted its place between them, something neither of them could step around anymore. She did not answer right away. Her fingers traced the edge of the silver piece at her neck, slow, thoughtful, not holding it tight this time, just feeling its shape, like she was remembering something she had not allowed herself to remember before. The fire gave a low crack, one of the logs folding inward on itself, and the glow softened further, painting the cabin in a quiet amber that felt less like shelter and more like truth. Ethan moved then, not toward her, but past her, crossing the room to a small shelf near the far wall, his steps steady, unhurried, the way a man moves when he has already made the only decision that matters. He reached up and took down something wrapped in cloth, worn from years of being handled and set aside, and for a moment he just held it there, not opening it, not turning back, as if the act itself carried more weight than what it revealed. She watched him, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition of that pause, the kind that comes when the past stands too close to ignore. "What did she mean?" she asked quietly, her voice no longer guarded, but careful in a different way, like stepping onto ground that might hold or might not. Ethan turned then, slowly, the cloth still in his hands, and for the first time since the night began, there was something in his expression that was not entirely still, something that carried memory not yet settled. "I did not understand it then," he said, his voice lower, shaped by something older than the words themselves. "I thought she meant things like land, like names, like the kind of things men argue over until they forget why they started." He stepped closer to the table, setting the cloth down gently, unfolding it with care, each movement deliberate, revealing a small object inside, worn by time, shaped by hands that had carried it long before it came to rest here. The firelight caught it, a faint glint of silver, nearly identical in shape to the one she wore, though older, the edges smoother, the marks of use deeper, like a story that had been told too many times to remain sharp. She did not move at first. Her breath slowed, her eyes fixed on the object as if the distance between it and her was not measured in feet, but in years she had not yet lived. "She gave that away," she said, almost to herself, the words barely more than a whisper, but clear enough to settle into the space between them. Ethan nodded once. "To someone who did not know what to do with it," he replied, not with regret, not with apology, just with truth. "I kept it because I thought keeping it meant honoring it." He paused then, his gaze lifting to meet hers again, steady, open in a way it had not been before. "But I think she meant something else." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, stretched between what had been and what might still be understood, and slowly, she stepped closer, not with caution now, but with something quieter, something that no longer measured every movement against danger. She stopped at the table, her hand hovering above the object without touching it, as if the space between them held more meaning than contact ever could. "She was my grandmother," she said finally, her voice steady, grounded, no longer hiding behind distance or defense. Ethan did not react with surprise. He did not step back or question it. He simply nodded, as if the truth had already found its place before she spoke it aloud. "I figured," he said softly. Outside, the night remained still, the riders gone. The valley quiet again. But inside the cabin, something had changed in a way that could not be undone. Something that had nothing to do with who had left and everything to do with what had finally arrived, not by force, not by demand, but by being recognized at last. The truth settled between them without needing to be repeated, and for a moment neither of them moved, as if speaking again too quickly might disturb something that had taken years to find its way back into the world. The two silver pieces lay close now, one resting on the table, the other against her skin, and in the quiet glow of the fire they no longer looked like separate objects, but parts of the same story that had been carried along different paths until this night pulled them together again. She lowered her hand slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of the one on the table at last, not grasping it, just touching it lightly, like greeting something familiar that had been gone too long. Ethan watched without stepping closer, his presence steady but distant enough to let the moment belong to her, because he understood that some things were not meant to be witnessed too closely, only respected. "She told me once," she said after a while, her voice softer now, no longer guarded, no longer shaped by the need to survive each second, that the world forgets what matters when people try to own it. The words hung in the air, simple, but carrying more weight than anything that had been spoken outside that door. Ethan nodded slightly, not as agreement alone, but as recognition, as if something he had carried without understanding had finally found its shape. "She said something like that to me too," he replied, his tone quiet, almost thoughtful. "I just did not listen the way I should have." The fire shifted again, a low collapse of ember that sent a brief pulse of light across their faces. And in that moment, the lines of distance that had defined their first meeting seemed to fade into something else, something less defined by where they came from and more by what they now understood. Outside, the night stretched calm and empty, the tracks of the riders already beginning to soften under the steady fall of snow, as if the land itself was choosing to erase what had come looking for something it did not deserve. She lifted the silver piece from the table then, carefully, turning it once in her hand, her eyes tracing the worn edges, the marks left by years she could not see but could feel, and when she looked up again, there was no hesitation left in her expression, only clarity. "This was never meant to stay in one place," she said, not asking, not guessing, but knowing. Ethan's gaze met hers, steady, certain in the same quiet way it had been since the beginning. "No," he said. "It was meant to move until it reached someone who understood it." She held his eyes for a long second, and something unspoken passed between them, not gratitude, not obligation, but something deeper, something that did not need to be named to exist. Slowly, she placed the older piece back onto the cloth, not keeping it, not claiming it, but leaving it where it had rested for years, and that single choice carried more meaning than any promise either of them could have spoken. Ethan noticed it, the way she did not take it, the way she understood without needing to be told, and he inclined his head slightly, a gesture small but filled with respect. "You could take it," he said quietly, not as an offer, but as acknowledgement. She shook her head once, her hand returning to the one at her neck. "I already have what was meant for me," she answered, and there was no doubt in her voice, no question left to settle. The cabin grew still again, but it was no longer the stillness of tension or waiting. It was the kind that comes after something has been set right without force, without struggle, and in that quiet, as the fire burned low and the night held steady beyond the walls, both of them stood on opposite sides of a moment that had changed nothing and everything at the same time. The fire had burned low by the time the silence settled into something complete, not fragile, not uncertain, but whole in a way that did not ask for anything more, and outside the first pale hint of morning began to press against the edges of the night, a thin gray light stretching slowly across the ridge like a promise that did not need to be spoken aloud. Ethan had not slept. He sat near the hearth, one arm resting across his knee, his gaze unfixed, not watching her, not watching the door, just present in the way a man is when he knows the night has already given him everything it came to give. She stood near the window, her figure outlined by that early light, her posture steady now, no longer shaped by exhaustion or fear, but by something quieter, something resolved. The knife was gone from her hand, set aside at some point neither of them had marked. In its place, her fingers rested lightly against the silver at her neck, not holding it, not needing to, just aware of it in the same way she was now aware of herself standing in a place she had not planned to reach. "They will not come back," she said softly, her voice carrying across the room without effort. And it was not a question, not even a guess, but something she understood without needing proof. Ethan lifted his eyes then, not quickly, just enough to meet the shape of her in the growing light. "No," he said. "Men like that do not return to doors that do not open for them." The words settled easily, without tension, and for a moment neither of them spoke again, because there was nothing left that needed to be argued or defended. The world outside had moved on. The night had done what it came to do. She turned from the window then, slow and deliberate, her boots quiet against the floor as she crossed the small space toward the door, and though the movement was simple, it carried weight, the kind that comes when leaving means more than just stepping outside. Ethan did not stop her. He did not stand. He did not offer words to hold her there. He simply watched, the same way he had watched everything that mattered that night, without reaching, without claiming, letting it be what it was meant to be. She paused at the door, her hand resting against the wood for just a second, and in that pause, the room seemed to gather around her. The fire, the table, the place where two paths had crossed and changed direction without force. "You knew," she said without turning, her voice quiet but clear, "before I said it." Ethan considered that for a moment, then gave the smallest nod, though she could not see it. "I recognized what was never mine," he answered, and there was no regret in it, only understanding shaped by time. She stood there a second longer, then opened the door, the cold morning air slipping inside, clean and sharp, carrying with it the scent of snow and pine and distance. The valley stretched wide beyond the threshold, untouched now, the tracks from the night already softened into the land, as if they had never been there at all. She stepped out into it without hesitation, her figure moving into the light that grew stronger with each passing second, and for a moment she stopped, just beyond the edge of the porch, her hand lifting once more to the silver at her neck, her fingers resting there like a quiet acknowledgement of something completed. Then she walked on, not looking back, her steps steady, her path her own again. Inside the cabin, Ethan remained where he was, the door still open, the cold air filling the space where the fire had once held everything close. And though nothing in the room had changed, it felt different now, not emptier, not fuller, just clearer, as if something that had been waiting had finally found its way through. He rose after a moment, slow, unhurried, crossing the room to the table where the older piece still rested on the cloth, and he looked at it not as something to keep, not as something to guard, but as something that had already done what it was meant to do. And in that quiet morning light, without words, without ceremony, he understood that some things did not belong to the hands that held them, but to the moments that returned them to where they had always been going. The door remained open long after she disappeared beyond the ridge, the cold air settling into the cabin as if it belonged there now, as if it had always been part of the space and had only been waiting for the right moment to return. And Ethan stood there for a while, without moving, not watching for her shadow, not expecting her to come back, just standing in the quiet that followed something finished. The valley stretched wide under the morning light, pale gold spreading slowly across the snow, softening every edge, every track, until the marks of the night before became nothing more than memory pressed into the land, already fading, already letting go. He stepped out onto the porch after a time, his boots meeting the cold wood with a sound that felt louder than it should have in a world that had gone so still, and his eyes moved across the distance not in search, but in acknowledgement, as if tracing the path she had taken even though it was already gone. There was no sign of her now, no movement, no shadow, only the quiet rise and fall of the hills and the long line of trees standing unchanged, as they always had, as they always would. Ethan rested one hand against the doorframe, feeling the rough grain beneath his palm, grounding himself in something solid, something that did not shift with the passing of people or the weight of moments. And for a brief second, something like a memory crossed his face, not sharp, not painful, just present, like the echo of a voice that no longer needed to be heard out loud. He stepped back inside then, closing the door without hurry, the latch settling into place with a soft, final sound that did not shut anything out, only marked the end of something that had already moved on. The cabin felt different now, not emptier, Not quieter, just clearer, like a space that had been used for exactly what it was meant to be and nothing more. The fire had nearly gone to ash, a faint glow still breathing beneath the gray, and he crouched beside it, adding a single piece of wood, not to build it back up, not to chase away the cold, but simply because it was what came next. The flame caught slowly, steady, patient, the way things do when they are not forced. He rose again and crossed to the table, where the cloth still lay open, the older silver piece resting where it had been placed, untouched, unchanged, and he looked at it for a long moment, not as something to keep, not as something to give, but as something that had already fulfilled its purpose by finding its way through time, through hands, through choices, until it reached a place where it no longer needed to move. He did not pick it up. He did not wrap it away. He left it there in the open, where the morning light could reach it, where it could exist without being hidden or held, because he understood now that keeping something was not the same as honoring it. Outside, the wind moved lightly across the ridge, carrying nothing with it, no voices, no footsteps, no trace of what had come before, and inside, Ethan stood in the stillness of a place that had given shelter without asking, had stood firm without force, and had let go without regret. He moved to the window once more, his gaze resting on the horizon not in waiting, not in hope, but in quiet understanding, and in that moment, with the fire low and the day beginning, the only thing left behind was not what had been said or done, but what had been chosen, and out here, that was always enough.